The Red Mirror. Part 1, The Inheritance. It was a Sunday when Claire and Ben received the letter. A small, unassuming envelope with the word estate sale stamped in bold, faded ink across the front. Ben ripped it open, expecting nothing more than a flyer for a local auction, but inside was a note from Claire's late aunt, Evelyn. "I've left you something. Come by the estate if you want it. Trust me, it's worth your time. Don't ask questions. Aunt Evelyn." Claire, who had grown up hearing strange stories about her aunt's eccentricities, didn't think much of it. Evelyn had lived alone in a large, creaky house in the old part of town, famous for its oddities. The kind of place you drove past quickly, the windows dark, like something was always watching you from inside. Claire and Ben had only visited her once, years ago, and they both agreed the house gave off a strange vibe. But this was different. She'd never left anything to anyone before. They decided to go, mostly out of curiosity. The house was exactly how Claire remembered it. It looked abandoned, like no one had lived in it for years. The front door creaked open as if it had been waiting for them. Dust lingered in the air like ghosts, and the smell of old wood filled their nostrils. Claire wandered through the rooms, with Ben following behind her, until they reached the parlor. That's when she saw it. At the far end of the room, covered in a dark red cloth, stood a large, ornate mirror. Its frame was gold, decorated with intricate carvings, twisting vines, flowers, faces. It looked old, but in a beautiful, mysterious way. It had a sort of pull, like it wanted to be looked at. Ben walked over and uncovered it. The glass was smooth, shining in the dim light, but something about the mirror felt wrong. The reflection it showed wasn't just of the room, it was alive. The shadows seemed to dance behind them. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "What do you think, Ben?" He smirked, trying to make light of it. "It's a cool antique, I'll give it that. But there's no way I'm putting it in our living room. It's way too much." They both laughed, but deep down, Claire could feel an odd pulse in her chest, a sense of something unfinished, something about to happen. Part 2, The First Night. That evening, after returning home, they placed the mirror in their living room. They figured they'd leave it there for a while, let it settle into the house, and then figure out what to do with it. Claire was still uneasy. Something about the way the mirror seemed to watch them unsettled her. She caught herself glancing at it more than once, her reflection warping in strange ways. But that was just her imagination. After all, it was just a mirror. Right? Later that night, they sat on the couch, Ben flipping through channels while Claire, still restless, fiddled with her phone. She tried not to look at the mirror, but she couldn't help it. Every now and then, she'd catch a flicker of movement in the glass that didn't match what was happening in the room. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light. But then she saw it, her own reflection, grinning. A dark, twisted grin that wasn't hers. She froze. "Ben," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Ben, look." Ben didn't seem to notice at first. He turned toward her, but his eyes didn't focus on the mirror. "What? You all right?" She turned to the mirror, but the reflection had returned to normal. Her face, pale and wide-eyed, stared back at her. "Nothing," she said, swallowing hard. "I must be tired." Ben shrugged and went back to the TV. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling. Part 3, The Change. The days that followed were strange. The mirror became a constant in their lives, always there, always watching. Ben, ever the skeptic, insisted it was just an old piece of furniture. But Claire began to notice little things. Little changes. Things she couldn't explain. At night, She would wake up in the middle of a dream, only to find her reflection still awake in the mirror, staring back at her. It was like the mirror didn't know when to stop. She would look at it from across the room, and in the reflection, she would see herself, doing things she wasn't doing. Walking away from her own reflection. Crying. Smiling in ways she couldn't control. It was like someone else was inside her skin. Ben was the first to lose his grip. One evening, after a particularly stressful day at work, he stood in front of the mirror for what seemed like hours. Claire watched from the doorway, her heart sinking. He wasn't looking at himself, not really. He was staring into the glass, as if waiting for something to happen. "Ben," she called softly, but he didn't respond. She stepped closer, and the reflection in the mirror shifted. Ben's face contorted, and the reflection smiled. A smile that wasn't his. Claire gasped. "Ben!" She grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the mirror, but he didn't fight back. His eyes were empty, distant. That night, he slept on the couch. Claire couldn't bring herself to look at the mirror, but she couldn't stop herself from hearing the whispers. They were soft at first, like a breeze rustling through the trees outside. But then they grew louder. They sounded like her own voice, calling to her. "Come closer." The whispers turned to shouts, and Claire's skin crawled. She shut her eyes tight and forced herself to sleep. Part 4, The Truth. The more they avoided the mirror, the worse things got. Each time they walked past it, their reflections didn't quite match up. Claire's movements became jerky, unnatural, like she was being controlled by something behind the glass. Ben's behavior grew more erratic, his eyes wide, frantic. It was as though the mirror had begun to pull them in, showing them parts of themselves they didn't want to see. Then came the night it all broke. Ben didn't come home. Claire waited. Hours passed. The house felt colder. The mirror seemed to grow larger in the room, filling the space with its presence. When she checked the glass, she didn't see Ben's reflection. Instead, she saw herself standing there, smiling. But it wasn't her. She was different. Her eyes were hollow. Her smile too wide. The door slammed open, and Claire spun around. Ben stood there, but he wasn't the same. His clothes were torn, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale as death. In his hand, he held a shard of the mirror, red at the edges, almost as if it were bleeding. "You're not supposed to leave," Ben said, his voice hollow, distant. "It wants us here." And then, Claire understood. The mirror wasn't just showing their fears, it was feeding on them. It wasn't just reflecting their darkest thoughts, it was alive. And it wanted them trapped. In the reflection, Claire saw what was really behind her, the thing that had been lurking inside the glass. A dark, shifting shape that wasn't human. It was waiting. She screamed, but the mirror just smiled back. Part 5, The End. The next morning, the house was silent. The mirror stood in the center of the room, its surface dark and still. Claire's reflection was gone. Ben's too. And though the house was empty, something watched from the other side of the glass. It was waiting for the next pair of eyes to look into it.